So here I am back. Um, I want to talk about our first 6 months in Hong Kong. It was roughly after a good 15-hour flight, LA to Hong Kong direct, maybe. I don't remember if we changed planes or not. Otherwise, it was 20 hours. I've had that flight last up to 40, depending on layovers. So flights plus airports, I mean. And we arrived to our new life with two checked bags and one carry-on item a person. And we were staying at this at a friend's apartment. I had no idea how small apartments were in Hong Kong at this point because we had lived at a detox site that was like a campsite. But we had to climb what felt like hundreds of stairs to get there. There was air conditioning, but open doors and windows had allowed mosquitoes to get in. So my first night was tortured with rather ravenous tropical mosquitoes that seemed pretty thrilled to taste exotic blood. I don't know if that's a real thing. I just know that my Chinese friends, I would later learn, did not get bit the way I did. Um, and I woke up the next morning with a big old mosquito bite on my eyelid that proceeded to swell over the next couple of days. Well, day 4 was a staff camp where we were about to meet the church leaders of this large 2,000 person church that we were getting ready to work with. I suppose it wasn't 2,000 people yet. It became that. But anyhow, so and then I remember the first day of the camp, they went after Mariah, and one of her new friends helped her apply medicine to her bites. And by all was said and done, she had like 130 mosquito bites from just the first night on this campsite. And to be clear, this was not an outdoor tent camping. Like this was more like a retreat. Um, we were in dorms, like at, like a kid's summer camp. I remember staying up all night. I was jet lagged anyway, so that wasn't hard. With some of the younger leaders in that church were all taking advantage of the company playing a form of Chinese poker, but without the gambling. I learned how to play it that night. And my first impression of our new pastor, uh, my very first time meeting him, he was soaking wet because he was in the middle of a water fight with his son, who is a year older than me. And I thought, wow, this dude's pretty cool, pretty funny, and these people seem to know how to have fun. Um, Now, the next day was going to be my first challenge to that. Man, they got serious and intense too. The pastor was talking about, and I did not understand him, by the way, and I did not understand the majority of people. I had lost most of my Cantonese in the 5 silent years. Um, and um, there were a handful of people who spoke English who translated for me. There was also a lot of people who were really freaked out by English, and I would later learn were really triggered by my inability to speak anything else, which requires a little bit of cultural backstory that I may give later in my sharing. Um, but our biggest, most important project they gave us in that camp was to come up with a 5-year plan for your life. Now, I was a 15-year-old kid who just said goodbye to my friends, just said goodbye to my family, my older brother and sister, was there with like a downsized version of the Isom family from 6 of us to 4 of us in the middle of this huge transition. And I was like, so I'm here because of the family calling. I have no idea what I'm going to be doing by the time I'm 20. I've got 2 more years till graduation. That's already like a big ask to think about. I guess 2.5. Anyway, um, yeah, that was already a big ask to think about. And I can remember when Dad asked me my thoughts on it. Um, at the time, instead of being able to just say, hey, this is a big ask, I'm not ready for this. I went off and like cried for an hour because suddenly like Hong Kong wasn't just that place I wanted to go back to, but this was like a very different Hong Kong from my memory, and a lot was I felt like a lot was suddenly being asked of me, and I was very overwhelmed. So that was the launching into, basically I went into a crisis that lasted in some form actually into my early 20s of, God, why am I here? Am I just here because my parents are here, or what's your purpose? And I did feel his reassurance that he called me there too, but what specifically he wanted me to do I didn't know. And the primary reason why that was like a crisis for me was because there was so much pressure in this church for everybody to know, that I would later learn far past like this initial shock to my system. Um, so, I mean, the next several months were spent in, getting settled in a place to live, figuring out, getting everything together so we would cook. I still hate instant ramen noodles in a package because we ate that like at least once a day for our first month, while we were like getting everything in order. And yeah, it was a surprisingly difficult adjustment. I suddenly had random guys hitting on me on the streets, claiming I was too friendly. I'm a Kansas girl, and there were cultural things I didn't know, like not looking people in the eye who you don't know while you're walking down the street. To this day, I still avert my eyes while I walk by somebody unless we're ready to engage in direct conversation. Um, it just, there was so much. It was so different as a teenager. And I think, in a way, my wanting to go back to Hong Kong was my wanting to go back to childhood. Um, Also, I mentioned I had forgotten all my Chinese. It took me 6 months before I was conversational again. Um, and I say conversational again, but really it was conversational on a new level because I had a child's level of Cantonese when I had left. And to put this in perspective, Cantonese is a very hard language to learn. It takes the average English speaker 7 years of full immersion to attain fluency. I moved much faster because I was not learning as an adult. Um, you know, and There was other things like, so recovering drug addicts tend to be very grateful to the people who help them. And I was in a community of teenagers. It's a very different it's a very different scenario. And so, when I was struggling to learn, I'd have people who could speak English come up to me and ask me questions like, well, why isn't your English as good as so and so? I mean, why isn't your Cantonese as good as so and so? Who had been there like a year longer than me or something, And then when I pointed that out, I got responses like, well, maybe you're just not trying hard enough. And some of that, though, I was beginning to learn at the time was that in the Hong Kong Chinese education system in the 90s, um, intelligence and the ability to learn English were made equal. And I think it was part of some of the colonial attitudes that had been there with Hong Kong being a British colony for 100 years. And so me just sitting there speaking English was triggering um, people, triggering narratives of not being smart enough. And when I discovered that, in some ways, I was more motivated to learn, although I was already highly motivated, but it also made me feel worse. Like I just could not learn Cantonese fast enough. Um, and my primary compensation in this very difficult lonely season um, was I decided it was time to learn an instrument. I think I'd mentioned I'd taken piano lessons when I was 9. Well, at this point, I picked up guitar and I got mom and dad to teach me what they knew. And once I had finished learning what they knew, I started learning from people in church because even though I couldn't necessarily communicate verbally, music is a universal language. So that covers the first 6 months. I probably won't go quite as slow in future videos, just give, give some highlights or whatever, but I hope everyone is enjoying this.